Sometimes people ask about the God of the Old Testament, who seems to be a God of justice and a God of wrath, and the God of New Testament is the God of love. Well, that's really a false distinction. And perhaps the problem arose in around the year 140. There was a man who came to Rome. He was born in Samaria, I believe. Father was a priest, and he himself was a great orator, became enamored with the Church of Rome. But he developed the idea that anything Jewish was bad. And so he had this idea that the God of the Jews was the God of wrath, the God of justice. And that certainly was not our Christian God. That was a different God. And he himself revised in fact, he himself was probably the one to whom we should attribute the final canonization of the books of the Scripture. Because he himself said, well, in the New Testament there are only 10 books, the epistles of St. Paul and one gospel, the Gospel of Luke. Why? Because the epistles of St. Paul had to do more with Gentiles than Jews, and the Gospel of Luke is the gospel for the Gentiles, and he denied any of the rest of the books of the New Testament. And as far as the Old Testament goes, he thought that the God of the Jews was not the real God. So this particular person named Marcion, not with a T-I, but with a C-I, M-I-R-C-I-O-N, Marcion said this, and the church says, no, Marcion, you are wrong. First of all, then the church gathered and said, these particular books belong to the New Testament and to the Old Testament. And there's no difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. Same God. And it seems that at times, the Old Testament, they're talking about fighting and the Lord taking up the sword and bludgeoning your enemies. That's only because really the Jews had an awful tough time of it sometime trying to protest that there's only one God and you can't make an idol out of him and so on. The Old Testament, though, reflects the love of God. When Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? He said, well, how do you read? How do you read the Old Testament, or the books of the Jews? And the person says, well, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, strength, and mind. And Jesus said, yes, and your neighbor as yourself. He just quoted 2 Old Testament passages. Deuteronomy 6:5, love your God above all things. Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. So love, the God of love, is the God of the Old Testament. We find the mercy of God extolled in the Psalms. For example, I think it's, I want to say Psalm 136. It may not be that, but there's a refrain, give thanks to the Lord for he is good, his mercy endures forever, which is the refrain for every single verse of that long psalm. There's the Psalm, I think it's 8, where we thank God who has created all things and who's made all of us and to be his brothers and sisters. And so throughout the Old Testament, especially maybe in the books of the prophets, where the prophets emphasize the love of God, and sometimes they had to emphasize, God is the God of justice because the people had gone astray. But it's still the God who is merciful, the God who is forgiving. And of course, Jesus recognizes this in his life. He shows that this one God, who unfortunately had to punish Israel many times, is still the God of forgiveness and the God of love. And so he says, the greatest commandment, love God. Second, love your neighbors yourself. And in every way then, we honor the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament. To say that he is the God of love does not obviate or preclude the fact that he is still the God of justice. He still punishes evil. And so we must try to do penance for our evil, be sorry for it, and then show God's love by the way we live, by loving our neighbor as ourselves.